and I will turn this over to Greg Core to get us started.
Thank you, Blythe. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining today's DMS monthly TA call. It's a kind of a cool, gray, slightly drizzly day here in DC. All the cherry blossoms are in full bloom. I think the rain is probably deterring some of the tourists. I did get down to the tidal basin for a little bit yesterday because I knew the storms were coming, and they are really gorgeous. And everybody's hoping that they survived the rain last night and today, and that they'll be available for the weekend. This afternoon, we'll be focusing on one of the critically important pieces in the general supervision puzzle. That's dispute resolution. The DMS team members have developed a very informative presentation that I think will benefit all states, but especially cohort 1 states as they prepare for their upcoming monitoring reviews. I want to extend my appreciation to the cohort 1 state staff for their cooperation in working with OSEP's DMS teams throughout the phase 1 process. We're looking forward to moving to phase 2 later this spring and our on-site, or as the case might be, virtual engagements with those cohort 1 states. But before we launch today's presentation, I want to call your attention to a letter that Secretary Cardona released earlier today. Hold on just a second here. Okay, released earlier today. In the letter, he provides some updates and resources to aid in educators' efforts to mitigate the spread of COVID-19 in schools and ensure all students can safely return and learn in person to the maximum extent possible. Note that the letter really does focus on the needs of students with disabilities as we move to this new phase of our response to the pandemic. The document's intended to help educators, staff, and families thoughtfully design learning experiences for all students, including those students with disabilities. It reviews some important strategies. Sorry for that. My screen keeps disappearing here. It reviews some important strategies for doing so and reiterates key rights afforded to students with disabilities to make sure they can maintain equal access to in-person instruction and receive a FAPE, a free appropriate public education, in the LRE, least restrictive environment. Consistent with federal civil rights laws, this must be done so that students with disabilities do not face risk to their school-related health needs. Previously released guidance, this letter not only references previously released guidance, but also provides some tips about the current situation. It includes policy guidance and examples of processes to help deliver safe in-person learning. It builds on, okay, I've already said that. The letter can be found if you go to the ed.gov website in the coronavirus section. If you've been there before, you know what I'm talking about. And then click on special education and you'll see a letter with today's date on it, March 24th, 2022. And I urge you to read it. It's got a lot of information. It's about 8 pages long, but definitely worth spending a little bit of time on. So without any further ado, I want to turn the presentation over to our DMS implementation team facilitator, Kate Moran. Kate?
Thank you so much, Greg. And Blythe, you can move to the next slide, to our agenda slide. Just a note, as Greg was speaking, we did put the link to the letter that he was talking about in the chat, so you can access that there. And also today's presentation, if you do have questions, you can use that chat function. It will come directly to us, and we'll talk about those questions a little later on in the presentation. I think the format for today is a little bit different than we've had in the past, so just keep that in mind. So welcome again. We're excited to be back to continue our conversation around our dispute resolution protocols. With us today are Rhonda Sortino and Janae Norbert. Marjorie Thompson is out, so she wasn't able to present with us today, but she is also one of the component leads for dispute resolution for our DMS process. So today we're going to provide a brief update on some stakeholder input and local component activities that we've sent some communication about. And then we're going to dive right into the due process and mediation protocols, talking about the framework generally, the definition, overarching questions, and then really diving into those historical findings. So with that, we'll move to the next slide, please. All right, so we are going to be providing some updates on our stakeholder input process and local component activities. Included on this slide is a link to the email that Greg sent out. So if you have a login to our Engage OSEP site, you would be able to access that there in case it got lost in the mix of your emails. So we just wanted to provide that link. But next month's National TA Call on April 28th, we'll walk through this whole process, our different stakeholder groups that we've talked about on some of our other calls, the PTIs, PNAs, SAPs, and SICCs in your states. And then we're also going to walk through the local component section that we have that we will be talking about how we're going to be working with your LEA and EIS providers and other local personnel in our monitoring activities. So just wanted to highlight there that there's more information about those stakeholder processes in that email, and we encourage you to review that if you haven't seen that already. So next slide. All right, so a reminder on our DMS page on the IDA website are the 3 protocols related to dispute resolution. State complaint we covered on last month's call, so if you missed that, there is a recording and the PowerPoint on the website. And then today we're going to talk through the due process dispute resolution protocol and the mediation protocol. Next slide, please. Highlighting again some of our key resources and partners in this work. There are some great Q&As, dear colleague letters that have been issued. We also have a full section of resources on our IDA website under dispute resolution where you'll find some of these links as well as others. And also just recognizing CADRE, the Center for Appropriate Dispute Resolution and Special Education. They are a great resource for you as a state to reach out to when you're evaluating your system to ensure that you have the policies, the procedures, that you've addressed the regulations that you need to throughout this process. So just want to continue to highlight CADRE in our work. Next slide, please. And you can just hit it again, Blythe. It's going to pull up a beautiful little map of puzzle pieces. All right, so as you've seen before, this is our puzzle of our general supervision monitoring and our DMS structure. So we are evaluating states across these multiple topics: fiscal management, integrated monitoring, data, SBP, APR, all those pieces we pull out with our separate protocols and then put them back together to really evaluate and understand a state system in totality. So the last month and then today, we're going to be talking about that one puzzle piece of dispute resolution. So next slide, please. All right, so highlighting again our framework for each puzzle piece or component of a state's general supervision system, we have outlined different expectations that we would have. So if a state has an effective system, whether it's dispute resolution, integrated monitoring, data, then there would be certain things in place that would lead to that ultimate outcome of improved outcomes for infants, toddlers, children, and youth with disabilities and their families. So the framework will identify some more detailed examples or evidence of examples that you may want to look through and use that in conjunction with our document request template that we have posted on our site as well. Next slide, please. All right, so getting into the due process protocol. Next slide. All right, so the overarching question. So on each protocol, we have a large overarching question that we're seeking to answer through a series of smaller questions. I guess we call those overarching questions too. This is the overarching question. So really looking at, does the state have policies and procedures and practices that are reasonably designed to implement the due process complaint requirements of IDEA, which include state complaint, due process, and that mediation piece. And so today we'll be talking about the mediation and due process, but keeping in mind that state complaints is a part of that as well. Next slide, please. All right, so the overarching questions on the due process protocol cross a number of different topics. So we're going to be wanting to understand how folks in your state are informed of due process complaints, how you're ensuring that your hearing officers are knowledgeable, how they're trained, how you're ensuring impartiality, and then also thinking about the resolution process, what procedures you have in there to ensure that you're implementing that in line with IDEA. Next slide, please. We continue through looking at written decisions, the timelines around those, talking about any expedited due process hearings, how those are implemented, any barriers that you faced, and then also just spending some time talking about how you actually implement and track the implementation of those due process hearing decisions, and then how you use that information generally within your own general supervision system. So how does that drive your focus? How does that maybe drive examination of local programs and information along those lines? Next slide, please. All right, so I believe at this point, I am turning it over to Rhonda.
Thank you, Kate.
Yeah.
So good afternoon. In addition to the due process overarching questions, we will also review due process policies and procedures and available due process hearing decisions from within the designated timeframe. Most of this information will be submitted by the state during the phase 1 document request period, while some of it may be retrieved by OSEP from the state's forward-facing website. Examples of documents that we have seen thus far include, but are not limited to, the parent and family rights packets, state policy and procedure manuals, and model form manuals. OSEP expects variety in the naming of documents and will work with each state program to ensure the submission matches the request. In advance of document submission, OSEP asks that the document request is reviewed in its entirety. Next slide, please. Your state may have supplemental materials that have been developed to provide guidance to stakeholders related to dispute resolution activities. Such documents would be appropriate to send to OSEP during the document request period. Examples of supporting documentation that we have seen thus far include stakeholder presentations, logs, trainings, brochures, MOAs, and evidences related to training requirements for mediators and facilitators. Again, the purpose of this review is for OSEP to gain a clear understanding of the due process system and your state program. Providing documentation that supports the structures and expected implementation should satisfy that purpose. Next slide, please. State programs organize their due process systems in two different ways, either as a one-tier or a two-tier system. In a one-tier system, the SEA or another state-level agency is responsible for conducting due process hearings, and an appeal from a due process hearing decision goes directly to court. In a two-tier due process system, the school district is responsible for conducting the due process hearings, and an appeal from the due process hearing is to a state-level review hearing before it gets to appealing to the court. There are differences in the timelines for issuing decisions and rights of appeal for each of these systems. Next slide, please. Under Part C of the IDEA, lead agencies have the option of adopting either the IDEA Part B or IDEA Part C procedures for due process complaints and hearings. A reminder, however, that there are important differences between IDEA Part B and IDEA Part C procedures that affect timelines, time limits, and other essential requirements. Next slide, please. This slide is just for your information. Current as of March 2020, 7 Part B and 3 Part C state programs utilize a two-tier due process system. Next slide, please. In the next several slides, we will walk you through examples of historical findings in due process. The link to previous monitoring reports will take you to the ed.gov website, where OSEP maintains a public listing of the most recent 3 years of reports and letters. Please note, this is different than what has previously been made available, so please contact your state lead at OSEP if reports or letters older than 3 years are needed. Next slide, please. Okay. Common findings. So historical monitoring reports have exposed many common findings. And in an effort to avoid findings in these areas, OSEP encourages state programs to review their policies and practices to ensure that they are aligned with federal regulations. Next slide, please. From here, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Janae Norbert, to take us on a deeper dive. Janae?
Thank you, Rhonda. As Rhonda stated, for the next several slides, we will be going over findings that were made as a result of monitoring visits, and then some required actions as a result of those findings. So for the first finding, it has to do with model forms and publicly available due process hearing findings and decisions. So for this finding, there were a couple of issues. Number one, a state was requiring the use of the state's model due process hearing form. So as a reminder, parents are not required to use, of course, the state's model form. And then number two, the state was not transmitting findings and decisions to the state advisory panel. And then they were not making those findings and decisions available to the public. So as a result, OSEP required the state to revise its policies and procedures to ensure that the state was transmitting, of course, those findings and decisions to the state advisory panel, and then making those findings available to the public. And the state was also required to submit to OSEP evidence that it was no longer requiring the use of the state's model form. So additionally, the state was also required to submit to us evidence of training. Okay. So next slide, please. Okay, so this finding had to do with access to hearing decisions. So in this instance, the state was requiring that the public submit a FOIA request in order to access due process findings and decisions, which of course is inconsistent with IDEA regulations. So OSEP required the state submit to OSEP evidence that it had removed this requirement from its state's policies and procedures. So pretty straightforward. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so this finding was in regards to timely implementation of due process hearings. So specifically, the state was not ensuring that the public agency involved in the due process hearing was implementing hearing officers' decisions in a timely manner. So this, of course, the state needs to have a mechanism for both the tracking of the decisions and its implementation. So as a result, OSEP required the state to provide us documentation demonstrating that it had established procedures to ensure that the public agency involved in the due process hearing implemented the hearing officer's decision in a timely manner. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so in this case, which had to do with the due process hearing extensions, we found that the state was not in compliance with the requirement that when hearing officers granted specific extensions of the 45-day timeline for issuing final decisions in due process hearings at the request of a party, that they specified either the length of the extension or the new date by which the hearing officer must mail that decision to the parties. So as a result of that finding, the state was required to submit to us documentation, including statewide procedures demonstrating that the state ensures compliance with IDA, that a hearing officer may only grant specific extensions of the time beyond the 45-day timeline at the request of either party. And they were also required to submit a copy of a memo to be issued to all hearing officers, LEAs, parent advocacy groups, and other interested parties, advising them of those specific Part B regulations. Okay, so next slide, please. Okay, so similar to the last example, but this one is a little bit more complex. A state had a specific policy that permitted parties to move the hearing off calendar for up to 6 months. So OSEP found that this policy, of course, was inconsistent with the state's duty to ensure that decisions in due process hearings are reached and mailed to the parties within the 45-day timeline, unless, a hearing officer grants a specific extension at the request of a party to the hearing as required by IDEA. So as a result of this finding, the state was required to provide to OSEP, 1, documentation demonstrating that the state had either removed the specific off-calendar policy or had revised the policy to ensure that it could be implemented in a manner that complies with the requirement that hearing officers grant specific extensions of the 45-day timeline for issuing final decisions in due process hearings. And then number 2, provide to OSEP a copy of a memo issued to all hearing officers again, LEAs, parents, and advocacy groups, and other interested parties, advising them that the state had either removed the off-calendar policy or had revised that policy to be consistent with Part B regulations. All right, next slide. Okay, so this finding had to do with resolution meetings. All right. So for this particular finding, the state did not have a mechanism for tracking whether an LEA convened a resolution meeting within 15 days of receiving notice of the parent's due process complaint, unless the parties agreed in writing to waive the meeting or to use mediation. And the state did not have a mechanism to track the resolution period, the hearing officer timeline, and the outcome of the resolution process. So, as a result of those findings, the state was required to submit to OSEP evidence that it had developed a mechanism to track this process, and if an LEA failed to convene a resolution meeting as required, the state made a finding of noncompliance and ensured that the LEA's noncompliance is corrected as soon as possible, and in no case later than 1 year of the state's identification of the noncompliance. Right? Okay, so that does it for me. I will turn it back to Kate. Thank you, Kate.
Thanks, Danae. Blythe, you can go to the next slide, please. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit now about the mediation protocol. This is the last of the dispute resolution protocols that we have. Again, all of these calls will be recorded, so you can refer back to last month's state complaint call and then this one together to kind of see them in totality. So next slide, please. So each of our protocols has that large question that we're trying to answer, followed by some overarching questions. And those each have within those sections general information about the requirement or question. There are possible follow-up questions that we might ask. And it also includes information about issues or areas of concern that we would want to clear up and understand more about. So with mediation, again, we're looking at policies, procedures, and practices to implement the mediation requirements. Next slide, please. So the overarching questions that we're looking at related to mediation deal with ensuring that parties to the disputes are able to resolve those through this mediation process, that it is both a voluntary and confidential process. We want to ensure and understand how those mediators are qualified, how states and LEAs ensure that they are impartial. And then ultimately, we're looking at mediation agreements and enforceability around those. So next slide. All right, I'm going to turn it back over to Rhonda, but I'll just do a reminder in case folks came on the call late. If you do have any questions, you can use the chat function. That will come directly to me so we can respond to those questions. So take it away, Rhonda.
Awesome. Thanks, Kate. In addition to the mediation overarching questions, we will also review mediation policies and procedures, available mediation documents from within the designated time period. Most of this information will be submitted by the state during the phase 1 document request period, while some of it may be retrieved by OSEP from the state's forward-facing website. Examples of documents we have used thus far in our monitoring include, but are not limited to, the parent and family rights packets, state policy and procedure manuals, and other Q&A type documents. Again, OSEP expects variety in the naming of documents and will work with each state program to ensure that the submission matches the request. Again, in advance of document submission, OSEP asks that the document request is viewed in its entirety. Next slide, please. Your state may have supplemental materials that have been developed to provide guidance to stakeholders related to mediation activities. Such documents would be appropriate to send to OSEP during the document request period. Again, we have examples of supporting documentation that include stakeholder presentations, files, logs, trainings, brochures, MOAs, and evidences related to training requirements for mediators and facilitators. Again, the purpose of this review is for OSEP to gain a clear understanding of mediation in your state program. Providing documentation that supports the structures and expected implementation should satisfy this purpose. Next slide, please. In the next several slides, we will walk you through examples of historical findings in mediation. The link to previous monitoring reports will take you to the ed.gov website, where OSEP maintains a public listing of the most recent 3 years of reports and letters. Again, please note this is different than what has previously been made available. Please contact your state lead at OSEP if reports or letters older than 3 years are needed. Next slide, please. Common findings in the area of mediation include state programs not ensuring their mediators are qualified and impartial, and failing to select mediators on a random, rotational, or impartial basis. Federal regulations dictate, among other things, that mediation is conducted by a qualified and impartial mediator who is trained in effective mediation techniques. Further, the state must maintain a list of individuals who are qualified mediators and knowledgeable in laws and regulations relating to the provision of special education and related services. In alignment with federal regulations, the SEA must select mediators on a random, rotational, or other impartial basis. Next slide, please. From here, I'll turn it back over to my colleague, Janae.
Awesome. Thank you, Rhonda. All right, so the next couple of slides are examples of findings around mediation. So for this one, it had to do with conflict of interest. So for this particular finding, we found through interviews and conversations with the state that they had a practice of using their state employed mediation coordinator to sit in on mediations as a method of quality control when a mediator was new. And they were also available to be called to discuss information during mediations. As an employee of the SEA, OSEP concluded that this was in conflict with IDA requirements that mediators not be an SEA, that mediators not be an SEA employee. So as a reminder, mediators need to be impartial and have no personal or professional interests that would conflict with the mediator's objectivity. Okay. Next slide, please. Okay, so although this finding is titled mediation, this one also applies to state complaints and due process hearings. So in the past, we found that on some occasions, the state was able to verbally describe its practices around dispute resolution, but it did not have actual written policies and procedures around state complaints, mediations, and due process hearings. So therefore, we require the state to develop and submit written dispute resolution policies and procedures and provide evidence of training. All right, so in general, as Kate stated earlier in the presentation, we ask that you work with our national TA provider cadre that is tasked with delivering technical assistance, informational support, and other services to states as it relates to dispute resolution. Right, so this concludes my portion of the presentation, and I'll hand it back over to Kate, I believe.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Janae. So we will open it up at this time for questions. I don't believe that this has a raise hand feature, but again, you could use the chat. Blythe, is there any way for them to communicate, or can they just unmute themselves?
Yes, they can actually, if everyone were to navigate to the toolbar at the bottom of their screen and click, I'm trying to remember what it is, expressions or emojis, the reaction, there should be an option to raise hands there.
Okay.
And they can unmute themselves. So if they raise your hand, you may want to call on them and we can monitor the chat as well.
Yep. So at this time, if you have any questions about the information we shared, we'd be happy to discuss those. And if we don't see any questions, then we'll go ahead and we'll end. Again, next month, we will be covering the stakeholder input process in addition to our local component to talk about what's happening with those two pieces. For states, I'm not seeing any questions in the chat or hands raised. Do you see any, Blythe?
I do not. If people are comfortable and wanted to, another option, if it's easier, is to come off camera to show physically in real life that you're raising your hand.
Yeah. All right. Well, not seeing any. Again, if you have any questions when we get off today, please feel free to reach out to your OSEP state lead. They'll be able to get in contact with the DMS monitoring teams. And again, this will be posted. Want to thank Janae and Rhonda today for presenting. And this will be on the website soon for review and for download of the PowerPoint. So thank you, everyone. Hope you have a good rest of your week and weekend. And we will see you again at the end of April, April 28th, 4 p.m. Mark your calendar.